Well, hello and welcome back to Read Becca. It's again that time of the year where we look back on our previous year and think about what all our favorite reads were. As usual, I loved too many books in 2024, so I'm splitting my favorites into fiction and nonfiction. Somehow I have ended up with 10 exactly for my favorites in nonfiction, and I'm not ranking them in any order because you can't rank your favorites, I don't think, for me personally. But I also kept leaning into honorable mentions, and that list just kept growing. So I wound up just cutting it off and saying, no, we're not going to do any honorable mentions. This is the cream of the crop. So let's dive into the books. First, my one reread of the list is Kitchen Confidential. I have read this multiple times and love it every time. This was Anthony Bourdain's entry onto the public scene that made him famous, and it is ostensibly an expose of what's going on behind the scenes in the kitchen of your favorite restaurant and the drama back there. It was giving the average person a view into the kitchen before we had sort of chef culture and food television, before that had gone crazy. And now we much more are familiar with a lot of that stuff. But he was kind of the inciting incident. And this book is very snarky, as is his usual tone, but also it still has a good amount of levity and compassion to it. It carries his passion for food and the way that it connects people. And I think that is what has drawn me to all of his work, really, over time. But this certainly was the start of that, and I just love this book for all those aspects. Next, let's go to my favorite memoir, Life on Other Planets. And this is such a great memoir because it's not just memoir. It's incorporating so many aspects about art and science and history and the people who were influences on the author as she grew up, being focused in both the arts and sciences, followed diverging paths over her life and into adulthood in those areas, where she initially started pursuing science and math and then didn't feel as welcome in those areas in academia as a woman and person of color. And so she changed focus and went into acting and performance arts, and eventually went back to school and pursued a scientific career, and now is an astrobiologist. And there were so many steps along the way and influences that encouraged her to pursue those different areas. And now she also is bringing in her influence to the next generation, influencing young women to pursue STEM careers in a way that incorporates art. So very, very inspiring memoir. The next one is probably my favorite biography of the year, Scribbles, Sorrows, and Russet Leather Boots, the biography of Louisa May Alcott. This was such a powerful biography, and it is written for younger readers, a YA or middle grade audience, but I didn't find it to be simplified at all or simply written. I think it would be accessible to readers of all ages, but I found the writing beautiful and the content very, very thorough. So this blew me away because I didn't know that much really about Louisa May Alcott, other than having read some of her fiction, including her most popular, Little Women. And I knew that was drawn from her own real life, but I didn't realize how much in conversation her real life was with the story she wanted to tell and things she wanted to change in her real life. The very harrowing experiences she went through and hardships she went through is one of the main things I took away, and how she reacted through those hardships, including for large parts of her life, basically supporting her family. And yet she was this very fiercely independent woman. And so I learned a ton about this author that I felt like I knew through her writings, but I really didn't know that much about her personal story. Next up, Shakespeare's Restless World. This is kind of my favorite micro-history of the year, I would say. It's broken up into little essays on a topic defined by an object or an item that existed around the time of Shakespeare and that ties in some way to something that occurred in Shakespeare's plays. And it really makes you recognize the ripple effects of innovations, of political change in the world, and how that infiltrates every aspect of the world and the arts, and what people are talking about in ways that are not necessarily obvious if you don't know the history. And so this was just such a fantastic case for really deep diving on the history. And yet in this book, it's these micro tiny bites of history that inform you and allow you to know more about Shakespeare's plays going in, the cultural and societal context for what was going on at the time that you may not see at first glance. Next, let's go to the hidden roots of white supremacy. This was such a great and very broad history, I would say, in terms of tackling a narrow focused topic. And very specifically, the author is diving into what happened before America, the influences of European colonization, the ideology that was present there that then fed into the Founding Fathers' ideology when building the Constitution and stratification of society that affected from initial colonization all the way through to the founding of the United States, that was white supremacist, underpinning the foundations of the country in America. And I think this was very powerful in terms of the presentation of information. I really think that the strength of the book is how the author took the effort to show the ideology and then provide examples, legal examples, over the course of hundreds of years in America to demonstrate how this has built on itself over the course of this country's lifetime. And everything ranging from the early days of treatment of indigenous peoples all the way up to more modern examples like the Tulsa Race Massacre. He does a deep dive throughout how all of these things trace back to these certain roots that he's inferring. And from there, I guess we will go to a book that's directly connected, that's Built from the Fire, which is a book entirely focused on the Tulsa Race Massacre, where in Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, we get a very focused account of the event. In this book, it's much more expansive and much more, I would say, narrative nonfiction, because we're following 100 years. So we actually start slightly before the massacre happened. And in this case, we're looking at, in Tulsa, Black Wall Street, these very successful people and families who were becoming entrepreneurs, business people. They were having success financially and economically and building the success of their community. And then we see this mass tragedy occur. We are following the fallout of that, both personally and legally. And what I love so much about this storytelling is that we follow this over the 100 years. So we're able to get invested, not just in the event and what happens immediately after, but the course of these people's lives, their families, the next generation. And we get to see the generational impacts play out even up to today, winding down with things during the current administration and reactions to what's going on, a modern day attempt at getting some legal reparation, because these people were deeply, deeply wronged by the political and legal system in our country, and there has been no justice for them. And so this is a story of deep injustice, but it's also a story that you get to see the successes and failures of these families over time and how this one event has changed so many lives. Next, let's go to, that was a BookTube Prize book, so let's go to my other BookTube Prize book that I have on this list. It was definitely a good year for BookTube Prize reads, and the other book I had from that experience was Crossings. A highly unusual book to be on my list, but this book is about road ecology, which sounds terribly boring. It also very heavily features roadkill, and yet it's so compassionate toward animals, and the focus of this book is all about seeing through a natural perspective, seeing how humans can build with nature in mind. And so I just loved the empathy and heart from this book. I also think that it was wonderful that it doesn't take a specifically Western lens. A big point of the book is talking about how we can learn from what other places in the world are doing in terms of their building, that they've innovated in ways that are more nature friendly. And so I just loved the aspects of hope and of optimistic design. Really, it was such a great read. Then let's round out with a trio of books that I think most fit under the political umbrella and all have very, very strongly interlinking themes that they're tackling. And I would say what most appeals to me, I think, about these three and why they made this list is that all three of them have a strong compassion and attempt to understand the person that they're talking about rather than attacking someone who is politically different from them. So The first of those is Doppelganger. This has been everywhere, so really I probably don't need to talk about it, but it certainly was a favorite of mine. And it is difficult to talk about because it's tackling so much, but it starts from the point that the author Naomi Klein is being mistaken for Naomi Wolf, who started out in a similar place ideologically. They both were sort of left-leaning feminist thinkers, and then Wolf swung hard right in the past 4 to 8 years. And so it starts from that jumping off point of understanding how someone who was ideologically similar could have wound up in this world of far right and conspiracy theory engagement. And it uses that as a jumping off point to talk about where our society is at, about the forces that are assailing us politically, informationally, the amount of disinformation and misinformation, algorithms and AI, among many, many, many other things. So it's just a potluck of topics, really, and yet it does all work, and that's why it's been on so many people's lists, I think. The second that also tackles a similar topic is Conspirituality. And this was from a trio of authors who are interesting in that one of them is an investigative journalist and the other two are kind of from yoga world, as they refer to it. And this is also looking at a cultural swing that was very, very popular, where people from the yoga and fitness, wellness culture world that was very much viewed as left-leaning also had a hard swing to the right and into conspiracy theories, including directly through their sort of wellness practices. And so this tackles that, but again, from a place of compassion about how did these people end up there. And not only that, but the guys that are talking about this have been taken in by some of this stuff. And so they're very transparent about certain things that they thought were scientific. And then on analysis, deeper diving, they realize it was a charlatan that took them in with a conspiracy theory. And they're very transparent about that over the course of what they're talking through, and just how hard it is for someone to filter. And that being a big problem that is facing us in modern culture, where we're bombarded with so much information. How do you filter what is factual from what's not, when someone can make up a very good replica if you're not actually an expert? So I really enjoyed this. I thought this tackled, again, a really wide variety. It wasn't just yoga. It was down to a real range, everything from that sort of yoga focus to MLMs and the growth of that, the ways that social media has been used to platform both these wellness elements, but then those people using their platform to spread misinformation and bad health information. And so I think that also verged into a lot of the same conspiracy theory territory as Doppelganger. And then rounding that out, we have the Exvangelicals. And this one is slightly removed, but I think it also fits very much. And this one is tackling, again, the past 4 to 8 years, a massive shift away from the evangelical church. While it seems very vocal right now and very prominent, there has been a real landslide of people leaving the evangelical church and the church in general currently. But what this is looking at, it incorporates the author's own personal experiences as someone who was raised very evangelical and now is involved in journalism as a political writer, and has kind of gone out and understood and experienced interviews with people who are still in that world and people who are breaking away from that world, and seen the harm done. So we're getting personal accounts from both the author and others she's interviewed about their experience growing up in that, about what they're feeling coming out of it. But at the same time, she's tying in the history of the current American evangelical, specifically church, and how that came to be really from a few powerful men who were seeking not necessarily Christ's message so much as a theocratic political power, and had sort of built this structure and ideology for driving toward that, beginning from the family unit and churches. And so that history is really fascinating and included a lot of my own personal experiences. So this definitely has some personal tie-in to me. I think what hit me hardest was sort of her finding in recent interviews that really very often it was the kid that was the most devout for their entire lives and now as an adult is seeing in the past several years that their church doesn't reflect or in any way align with the Christ message that they internalize. And so they just are feeling a massive break and don't have a place to go because that was their entire identity. And it is a very powerful story to both get the history and to get those personal experiences of trauma. It's also important that the author hasn't just focused on the stories of those who are completely leaving Christianity. She's looking at people who are just leaving the evangelical church and going to other areas of Christianity that they are finding are aligned with the Christ that they know. So I found it deeply powerful, but in part because it was so aligned with my own personal experiences growing up evangelical in the US. So that is it for my favorite nonfiction of 2024. And I think as soon as I stop filming, I will think of another one that I desperately wanted to be on this list, but we're going to leave it there. These were some fantastic books, and I am hopeful that 2025 will bring me even more amazing nonfiction. As always, thank you so very much for watching.